I will give you $5 million if you can read this letter." The most ruthless mafia boss in New York sneered in the middle of his lavish penthouse party, mocking the humble waitress standing before him. But when she spoke, the entire room fell into deathly silence. Evelyn Carter closed the door of her crumbling apartment in Brooklyn, her shoulders heavy as if carrying the weight of 3 jobs and a lifetime of grief. She should have been lying on her threadbare couch, watching over her 17-year-old sister Nora, who was sleeping with labored breaths, her lips tinged blue from the heart condition that was slowly killing her. The pile of hospital bills on the kitchen counter screamed $223,000, and the doctor's voice still echoed in her mind. Surgery within 2 months, or we will lose her. But at exactly 6 in the evening, her phone buzzed in her pocket, the screen lighting up with a message from Katie, her coworker and only close friend, accompanied by a string of crying emojis. "Eve, I have a terrible fever. Can you cover my shift tonight? It is the Ferraro Industries party at the tower. The tips will be insane. Maybe enough for Nora's medicine for a whole month." Eve stared at the message and sighed. She was exhausted beyond words, but she could not say no, not when every dollar meant another day of hope for her sister. And that was why, instead of watching over Nora, she was now standing in the service elevator of Ferraro Tower, a cold metal box carrying her up to the 90th floor penthouse where the most dangerous men in America would be drinking champagne and making deals that destroyed lives. She hated these parties, not because of the work, but because of the suffocating feeling of being invisible in a world of people who never had to choose between medicine and meals, a world where human worth was measured by the price of a watch, the cut of a suit, and the coldness in one's eyes. A world ruled by men who could end a life with a single phone call and never lose a moment of sleep. If you enjoy stories of courage against power, hit that like button and share this with someone who needs inspiration today. And do not forget to subscribe so you never miss what happens next. Do you believe that a single sentence can change destiny? Keep watching, because this waitress's answer will leave you breathless. The elevator doors slid open, and Eve stepped into a world utterly unlike the damp, crumbling apartment she'd just left behind. The service preparation area lay tucked away at the back, a narrow, airless room washed in cold, fluorescent light, a place where people like her were permitted to exist before being released into the outer rooms to serve the true masters of this city. Eve quickly shed her worn jeans and frayed sweater for a plain black uniform, a crisp white shirt pressed to perfection, and a dark apron tied snugly around her waist. She twisted her hair into a tight bun, wore no makeup, no jewelry, because the first rule of this job was to become invisible, to dissolve into shadow so the guests would never have to see the face of the person pouring their drinks. When she pushed open the door leading into the main hall, her breath caught painfully in her chest. The penthouse unfurled before her like a palace of darkness. Black marble floors gleaming beneath enormous crystal chandeliers suspended from a soaring ceiling, each one surely worth more than the apartment where she and Nora were barely surviving. The air hung heavy with the scent of Cuban cigars, rare whiskey, and expensive perfume woven together into a perfume of power, of wealth, of secrets buried beneath a flawless sheen. Classical oil paintings lined the walls. Dark bronze statues occupied the corners. And beyond the vast glass windows, all of New York sprawled below like a glittering carpet of light that the people here could trample whenever they pleased. Eve accepted a silver tray from the manager, its surface crowded with glasses of red wine glowing like blood, and began weaving through the crowd. She knew at once this wasn't an ordinary party. The guests were not the usual businessmen or politicians. Their eyes were sharp as razors, their smiles never reached their gaze, and the way they spoke to one another carried the careful precision of men who understood that every sentence might serve as someone's death warrant. Eve had heard the rumors about the Ferraro family, about a vast business empire everyone knew was merely a facade for far darker operations, about people who'd vanished without a trace after daring to defy them. She lowered her head further, softened her steps, trying to become a shadow slipping among wolves draped in $1,000 suits. One guest snatched a glass from her tray without so much as a glance. Another waved her aside as though brushing off an annoying insect. Eve swallowed it all, swallowed the humiliation, swallowed the slow burn rising in her chest, because every minute she stood here, every insult she endured, carried her closer to the money that would keep Nora alive for one more day. And amid all those dangerous, unfamiliar faces, her gaze drifted toward the central podium of the hall, where a man stood as though the entire world belonged to him, and perhaps it truly did. Salvatore Ferraro stood on the podium like a king surveying his kingdom, and every gaze in the room was drawn to him with undisguised awe. He was taller than most of the men present, his powerful frame wrapped in a perfectly tailored black suit that clung to every line as though it had been born on his body, a spotless white shirt without a single crease, and a black tie completing an appearance that was both elegant and lethal. His face was a flawless blend of beauty and danger, a jaw sharp as if carved from stone, eyes so dark and cold they resembled bottomless pits of ice, and black hair swept back to reveal a high, commanding forehead. At the age of 36, Salvatore Ferraro was already the boss of one of the most powerful mafia families on the east coast of the United States, having inherited the empire from his father Giovanni Ferraro, who had died 3 years earlier, and in those 3 years he'd turned the name Ferraro into a source of terror for enemies and allies alike. His voice carried across the space, low and rich, yet edged like a carefully honed blade. Every word weighted with absolute authority. "The Ferraro family doesn't merely exist," he said, his eyes sweeping the crowd as though counting sheep in a flock. "We dominate, and anyone foolish enough to believe they can challenge us." He paused, a thin, chilling smile forming on his lips. "Will discover how quickly the darkness can swallow a man whole." Applause erupted, yet Eve could sense the strain buried in every clap. This wasn't admiration, but fear disguised with practiced precision. In one corner of the room, Eve noticed an older man whispering to several gray-haired companions, all of them watching Salvatore with unreadable expressions. The man looked to be in his early 60s, his face etched with lines of age and calculation, fox-like eyes glinting beneath the chandeliers, and Eve happened to be standing close enough to catch what he was saying. Giovanni would never have lost the Miami contract. The man sneered in a sharp, venomous tone. The boy's got his father's blood, but not his brain. Too hot-headed, too arrogant, and too foolish to realize he's surrounded. The men around him nodded, dry chuckles slipping from their mouths like the hiss of snakes. Eve didn't know who the man was, but she could feel danger radiating from him even more thickly than the cigar smoke in the air. On the podium, Salvatore finished his speech and stepped down. Yet instead of blending into the crowd, he headed straight for the bar and motioned for the bartender to pour him a whiskey. He drained the glass in one swallow and set it down, signaled for another, then another. Eve watched from a distance and noticed something that perhaps no one else in the room wanted to see. Behind the ruthless exterior, behind the icy stare and the deadly smile, Salvatore Ferraro was furious, a slow-burning rage simmering inside him like a volcano on the brink of eruption, and she could read it in the way his jaw clenched, in the way his fingers tightened around the glass as though he meant to crush it, in the way his eyes flicked toward the corner where the older man was still whispering and smirking. He heard them. Eve realized with a chill crawling up her spine. He'd caught every word and was swallowing it down with each mouthful of whiskey. But sooner or later that fury would need an outlet, and she prayed she wouldn't be standing in its path when it did. Eve kept moving through the crowd with the silver tray balanced in her hands, trying to make her steps as light as possible, and her gaze remain lowered. Yet no matter how hard she tried to become invisible, fate seemed to have decided she wouldn't escape this night. Everything happened in an instant. A guest with a face flushed from drink and an unsteady gait suddenly turned, his elbow slamming into Eve's arm and knocking her off balance, the tray tipping as glasses of red wine like blood surged forward, straight toward the very man she'd been praying she'd never have to stand near. The dark liquid spilled across Salvatore Ferraro's spotless white shirt, blooming like an open wound over his chest, seeping into his black tie and dripping onto the marble floor with soft, ticking sounds that felt like a countdown to the last seconds of her life. The packed room of hundreds fell into absolute silence, a weight so crushing Eve could hear her own heart hammering wildly inside her ribs. The music was still playing, yet seemed to vanish into the endless space between her and the man standing before her, his black eyes lowering slowly to the stain on his chest before lifting to her face, and in them she saw the storm breaking loose. Survival instinct took over before thought could catch up. She hurriedly set the tray down and pulled a white cloth from her apron, trembling hands trying to blot the wine from Salvatore's shirt while her mouth spilled fractured apologies. "I'm terribly sorry, sir." Her voice shook so badly she could barely hear it herself. "Please forgive me. I didn't mean to. I'll pay for it. Her words were cut short by a sound that froze her blood. Laughter. Not a single laugh, but several low chuckles rising from the corner of the room where the older man she'd noticed earlier was standing. Giancarlo, because she now heard someone speak his name, was laughing with open delight, his fox-like eyes gleaming, as though this were the finest gift he'd received all evening. It seems even the great boss can't avoid being dirtied by a waitress. His voice rang out loudly enough for the entire room to hear. Giovanni would be so proud to see his son in this state. More laughter followed, thin and poisonous like the hiss of snakes, and Eve watched Salvatore's face change, his jaw clenching so hard she thought she could hear his teeth grinding together, his dark eyes igniting with a mad, burning light. His hand shot out and closed around Eve's wrist, fingers locking like steel clamps until a cry of pain escaped her, and he yanked her upright, forcing her to face eyes that had become bottomless pits of fury. "Perhaps this is why people like you should remain in the shadows." Salvatore's voice cut through the silence, cold as ice and sharp as a razor. "Do you have any idea how much this shirt costs? Or are such numbers meaningless to you because you'll never earn enough to afford even a single button from it in your entire miserable life?" The words struck Eve like knife thrusts to the chest. Yet she didn't cry. She'd forgotten how long ago. Instead, she simply stood there, brown eyes meeting the man, humiliating her, not with defiance or rage, but with something far deeper, the exhausted stillness of someone long accustomed to being trampled, and perhaps a flicker of pity for a man who didn't realize that cruelty doesn't make anyone stronger. It only makes them more alone. Eve lowered her head slightly. One final gesture of courtesy offered to the man who'd just humiliated her before hundreds of people. Then she turned and walked away, each step steady and composed as though those poisonous words were nothing more than a passing breeze. That calm, unsettled Salvatore more than any protest ever could, because he was used to people fearing him, begging him, kneeling before him. Yet this girl, this nameless waitress in a cheap uniform with calloused hands, dared to turn her back as if he were nothing at all, as if he were merely one more bastard she'd encountered and would forget by tomorrow. "Stop!" Salvatore's voice rang out, cold and threatening. Not a request, but an order, the kind no one in his world dared to defy. Eve halted but didn't turn around, her shoulders rigid as though bracing for another blow, because life had taught her that people with power were never satisfied with striking only once. Salvatore stepped in front of her, cutting off her escape, and in the instant they faced one another, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. He studied her with eyes still burning with anger, yet now laced with something else. Curiosity, irritation, at a puzzle he couldn't solve. His hand slipped into the inner pocket of his wine-stained jacket and withdrew an old envelope. The paper yellowed with age, and the corners worn thin from being handled too many times. The letter his father Giovanni Ferraro had left him before dying, written in ancient Latin he'd never been able to decipher despite hiring countless experts. "You look intelligent," Salvatore said with mocking amusement, his gaze raking over Eve's face as though searching for a weakness to strike. "So try this. $5 million. I'll give you $5 million immediately if you can read what's written in this letter." A murmur rippled through the room like waves across water. $5 million. A staggering sum tossed out as though it meant nothing. All to prove that this waitress was nothing but an ignorant nobody fit only for carrying trays. Eve stared at the envelope in Salvatore's hand. She knew it was a trap, a cruel game designed to humiliate her once more before dismissing her. Yet she also thought of $5 million, thought of Nora struggling to breathe on a battered bed, thought of the doctor's warning that surgery within 2 months was the only chance or she'd lose her, and she knew that money could save her sister 10 times over. "No thank you, sir," Eve said evenly, her voice calm and clear. "I only want to finish my job." Salvatore tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing like a cat watching prey. Her refusal only hardened his resolve to break her. "Afraid of being laughed at?" he asked in a syrupy tone. "Or is your pride worth more than $5 million? How many slum apartments like the one you live in could $5 million buy? How many hospital bills stacked on your kitchen table could it erase?" Eve froze. How did he know? How did he know about her apartment? About the hospital bills? And in that moment she realized people like Salvatore Ferraro knew everything about everyone, because information was power, and he never entered a battle without knowing his opponent inside and out. She lifted her head and met his gaze, and Salvatore saw something in those brown eyes he hadn't expected. Not fear, not anger, not hatred, but pity. She was pitying him. This poor waitress was pitying the richest mafia boss in New York, and it unsettled him so deeply he couldn't speak for several seconds. "Give it to me," Eve said, her voice strangely calm. "If you want to play this game, then play it to the end." Salvatore placed the envelope in her hand, a victorious smile spreading across his lips as he thought she'd finally yielded. Yet that smile would soon vanish, because he had no idea his fate had begun to change the very moment the letter touched the roughened hands of this woman. Eve held the envelope in her hands, feeling the weight of years pressed into the yellowed paper, and she knew the entire room was waiting for her to fail, waiting for the moment she'd stammer meaningless sounds so they could laugh, So Salvatore Ferraro could prove he was right, and people like her were nothing more than fools who didn't deserve to exist in his world. She slowly opened the envelope and drew out the sheet inside, flowing handwriting and faded ink revealing itself before her eyes. And in that instant, Eve was carried back to distant afternoons when her father, Thomas Carter, had sat beside her in their small, warm home, teaching her to read ancient Latin texts he said would one day be useful. He'd been right, even if he couldn't have imagined the day would come like this. Eve was silent for several seconds, her eyes scanning each line. Then her voice rose into the suffocating quiet, clear and exact, every syllable of ancient Latin pronounced flawlessly as though she'd spoken the language her entire life. Qui potentiam tenet et humanitatem obliviscitur, umbra sua devorabitur. Her voice didn't tremble or falter, each word flowing smoothly like running water, and the whole room froze in stunned disbelief. Salvatore stood as if struck by lightning, dark eyes wide, all the arrogance and fury draining from his face, and leaving only a naked shock he'd perhaps never known before. Eve lifted her head, brown eyes locking onto his, and she translated every word slowly and distinctly so no one present could miss a thing. The one who holds power and forgets humanity, she paused, her gaze piercing straight through him, will be devoured by his own shadow. Silence crushed the room so heavily every breath could be heard. Somewhere a glass shattered on the marble floor, but nobody turned to look. Every stare fixed on the waitress and the Mafia boss facing one another like colliding worlds. Eve folded the paper carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and returned it to Salvatore, her movement gentle and composed as though she were handing back a menu rather than a letter that had shifted everything. It seems your father understood this very well, Eve said softly, yet each word landed like a blade in Salvatore's chest. And you, she paused, studying him now, not with pity but with a deep sadness, you're forgetting it. Salvatore stood there clutching the envelope, unable to speak. This was his father's final message, the one he'd carried for 3 years without grasping its meaning, and now an unknown waitress had read it aloud before everyone he ruled. As for the money, Eve continued, her voice returning to cool calm. You can send it to Mount Sinai Hospital, Pediatric Cardiology Department, patient name Nora Carter. She's my sister and she needs heart surgery. If you're a man of your word, then do it, and if you're not, I won't be surprised. She turned and walked away, each step echoing across the black marble like the beat of war drums, and no one dared stop her, or even breathe too loudly, because they'd all just witnessed the impossible. A woman with nothing but courage had rendered the most powerful Mafia boss in New York speechless. Behind her, Salvatore still stood frozen, wine-stained shirt, his father's letter trembling in his hand. Hundreds of eyes on him now, no longer filled with awe but with curiosity and shock. And from the corner where Giancarlo lingered, he could sense the satisfied gaze of a man who'd waited for this moment a long time. Yet Salvatore saw none of it. In his mind, only her voice echoed again and again like a curse. The one who holds power and forgets humanity will be devoured by his own shadow. And for the first time in his life, the most ruthless Mafia boss in New York felt afraid. That night, after the last guest had departed and the penthouse sank into darkness, Salvatore Ferraro sat alone beside the massive glass windows overlooking New York City, the whiskey bottle on the table beside him already more than half empty, and his father's letter still clutched in his hand like a curse he couldn't release. He'd read those Latin lines dozens of times since she'd walked away, and with every rereading her voice echoed in his mind, clear and relentless. The one who holds power and forgets humanity will be devoured by his own shadow. His father had written those words for him, had tried to warn him from beyond death, yet it had taken 3 years and an unknown waitress for him to finally grasp their meaning. His phone kept vibrating with alerts, social media notifications flooding the screen, and when he opened them his blood seemed to freeze. Footage of the incident had spread everywhere. Someone at the party had filmed the entire moment from the wine spilling across his shirt to the girl reading the letter and walking away, and now the whole world was watching. The hashtag $5 million waitress was trending across every platform, millions of views, hundreds of thousands of comments, and most of them were mocking him, the Mafia boss brought down by a waitress, the ruler of New York taught a lesson in humanity by the woman he hadn't thought worthy of meeting his eyes. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Giancarlo, and Salvatore knew he couldn't avoid it forever. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Giancarlo's shrill voice snapped the moment he answered. "You've turned the Ferraro family into a joke for the entire world. Giovanni would be rolling in his grave if he saw you tonight. A waitress made you fall silent in front of all the elders. Do you think they'll still respect you after this?" Salvatore said nothing, He just listened while Giancarlo hurled accusation after accusation. And strangely, he didn't feel the fury he'd expected. Instead, there was a hollow emptiness inside him, as though the girl's words had carved a hole in his soul he didn't know how to fill. When Giancarlo finally hung up after a long stream of threats about the elders losing faith in his leadership, Salvatore remained seated in the dark alone, his thoughts circling back to her face, brown eyes fixed on him not with fear or hatred but with pity, and that tormented him more than any insult ever could. Who was she? How could a waitress read ancient Latin so flawlessly? Why had she looked at him as though she could see straight through him? And why couldn't he stop thinking about her? Salvatore lifted his phone and called Marco, his younger brother and most trusted right hand. "Find out everything about her," he ordered, his voice rough with whiskey and emotions he couldn't name. "Evelyn Carter, the waitress tonight. I want to know who she is, where she lives, who her family is, why she knows Latin. I want everything before noon tomorrow." He ended the call and stared out at the city below, millions of lights flickering like fallen stars, wondering which one belonged to the apartment where she lived, where she was sitting beside the heart-sick sister she'd mentioned in that steady voice. The next morning, in a shabby apartment miles away, Eve woke with swollen eyes from crying all night. Not because of the humiliation she'd endured, but because she feared she'd destroyed the only chance to save Nora. She grabbed her phone to check the time, and her heart nearly stopped when she saw a notification from Mount Sinai Hospital. A payment had been transferred into Nora Carter's treatment account, and when she opened it, her hands shook so violently she almost dropped the phone. $5 million. Exactly $5 million. Not a cent missing. Sat in the hospital account for her sister. Enough for surgery. Enough for treatment. Enough to give Nora a chance at life Eve had thought she'd never be able to provide. She sank onto the cold floor, staring at the screen. And for the first time in years, Eve Carter cried not from pain or despair, but from something she'd forgotten the feeling of long ago. Hope. Yet deep down she knew people like Salvatore Ferraro never gave anything for free, and sooner or later she'd have to face the price of those $5 million. At exactly noon that day, Marco stepped into Salvatore's office on the top floor of Ferraro Tower with a black leather briefcase in his hand and an unusually tense expression. Salvatore sat behind the massive black oak desk, dark circles under his eyes from a sleepless night, his fifth cup of coffee already cold beside him, and when his brother set the case in front of him, he knew whatever lay inside would change everything. "I found her," Marco said in a low voice. "But you're not going to like what I uncovered." Salvatore opened the case and pulled out a thick file, the first page bearing the photograph of the girl from the night before. Evelyn Carter, 27 years old, born and raised in Brooklyn, and beneath the image a name that made him pause. Thomas Carter, father. He turned the next page, and his heart seemed to stop for several seconds as he read the lines staring back at him. Thomas Carter, former chief accountant for the Ferraro family for 15 years. One of the men closest to his father, Giovanni Ferraro, dead in a car accident 5 years earlier. Body burned beyond recognition. Salvatore remembered that day. Remembered Giancarlo arriving with a mask of sorrow to tell his father that Thomas Carter had betrayed the family, stolen a vast sum, and planned to flee, only for fate to punish the traitor before the family could act. His father had believed Giancarlo, hadn't questioned it, had allowed Thomas Carter's death to sink into oblivion like hundreds of others in their world. But now, staring at the dossier, Salvatore began to wonder whether the truth had really been that simple. If Thomas Carter had been a traitor, why had he taught his daughter to read ancient Latin, the language Salvatore's father loved and used for his most important messages? If Thomas Carter had stolen money, why was his daughter living in extreme poverty, working 3 jobs at once, owing more than $200,000 in hospital bills for her heart-sick sister? If Thomas Carter had been a bad man, why had Evelyn Carter's eyes looked at him with pity instead of hatred, even though she must have known the Ferraro family had been tied to her father's death? Salvatore kept turning the pages, reading about Eve's life over the past 5 years, about dropping out of college to support her sister, about the slum apartment where the two of them lived, about Nora Carter, 17 years old, born with a heart condition and in urgent need of surgery, and every line struck his conscience like a blade he'd believed long dead. "Something isn't right," he muttered hoarsely. "Thomas Carter worked for my father 15 years. My father trusted him more than anyone. Why would he betray him?" Marco remained silent. Knowing these were questions Salvatore had to answer on his own. Salvatore closed his eyes, and Giancarlo's face from the night before rose in his mind. The pleased smile when he'd been humiliated. the fox-like gaze glittering with satisfaction, the whispered comparisons to his father like knives in his back. Giancarlo had been beside the Ferraro family since before Salvatore was born. He was the one who reported Thomas Carter's betrayal, the one who pushed to end any further investigation, the one who benefited most when the trusted chief accountant's position fell vacant. For the first time in 3 years of ruling, Salvatore began to see Giancarlo not as a loyal advisor, but as a potential suspect, and the thought made him shiver because if he was right, then everything he believed about his family was a lie. He needed answers, and only one person could give them to him. "Prepare the car." Salvatore rose to his feet, his eyes cold and resolute. "I need to see her." The glossy black Bentley came to a stop in front of the decaying Brooklyn apartment building like a blot of ink on crumpled paper, and when Salvatore Ferraro stepped out, he paused to take in the place where the girl who'd kept him awake all night lived. The building looked as though it might collapse at any moment, cracked brick walls stained with damp, rusted fire escapes creaking in the wind, and the stench of rotting trash drifting from the nearby alley making him frown. He'd spent his life wrapped in silk and luxury, had thought he understood poverty. Yet standing there, he realized he'd never truly known what it meant to be poor. Salvatore climbed the rickety stairs, ignoring the curious and frightened looks from residents at the sight of his expensive suit, and stopped in front of apartment 312. He knocked and waited, his heart beating faster than he cared to admit. The door opened, and Eve stood there, brown eyes widening in shock before narrowing into caution, as she blocked the doorway like a shield protecting whatever lay behind her. "What do you want?" she said coldly. "The money's been paid. I don't owe you anything." Salvatore glanced past her and caught a glimpse of the cramped interior, water stains spreading yellow across the ceiling, worn furniture sagging with age, and on a bed in the corner a young girl sleeping with a heart monitor clipped to her finger, skin pale and lips faintly blue. "I didn't come because of the money," Salvatore replied, his tone softening despite himself as he looked at the girl. "I came because of your father, Thomas Carter." Eve froze for several seconds, pain flickering in her eyes that she'd buried for 5 years. Then she stepped aside and let him in, not because she trusted him, but because she needed answers just as much as he did. She led him to the tiny kitchen far from the bed where Nora slept, and they faced each other in the cramped space close enough for Salvatore to smell cheap soap in her hair. "What do you know about my father?" Eve asked sharply. "And why do you care after 5 years?" Salvatore studied her and decided to tell the truth, sensing lies wouldn't get him anywhere with this woman. "Your father worked for my family 15 years, he said slowly. "He was the man my father trusted most. Then Giancarlo reported he'd betrayed us, stolen money, and tried to flee, and then he died in an accident." "My father didn't betray anyone," Eve cut in, voice shaking with anger. "He was the most honest man I ever knew. He wouldn't have stolen a single cent." "Then what happened?" Salvatore asked, and for the first time his voice held real curiosity instead of command. Eve fell silent, eyes drifting toward Nora, then began speaking in a low tone as though recounting a nightmare she'd lived through countless times. "That night 5 years ago, my father called me at 2 a.m, his voice so panicked I barely recognized it. He said he'd seen something he wasn't supposed to, that I had to protect Nora at all costs, that I shouldn't trust anyone, not anyone in the Ferraro family." She paused and swallowed, fists clenching tight. "He told me, 'Remember what I taught you?' Then the line went dead, and that was the last time I heard his voice. The next morning, police knocked and said he'd died in a car crash. His body burned beyond recognition, and I knew it wasn't an accident. But who was I to question the Ferraro family?" Salvatore stood in silence, every word striking at what he'd believed about his own family. "Giancarlo," he murmured, the name leaving his lips like a curse. "I don't know who killed my father," Eve said, "but I know he died because he knew too much, and I've spent 5 years just trying to survive long enough to one day uncover the truth." Salvatore looked into her determined brown eyes and made a decision that might change his life forever. "I want the truth too," he said, "and I've got the resources to find it. Work with me." Eve eyed him warily. "Why should I trust you? Your family might be the ones who killed my father." "Because I might be a victim too," Salvatore replied bitterly. "If Giancarlo lied about your father, then he could have lied about many other things, including my father's death." Eve studied him for a long moment, weighing every word, then nodded slowly. "Fine, I'll cooperate, but on one condition. If we find who killed my father, they pay, whoever it is, even if they belong to your family." Salvatore met her gaze and saw a fire he recognized because it burned in him as well, the fire of people willing to scorch the world for the truth. "Agreed," he said, And in that instant, inside the cramped kitchen of a run-down Brooklyn apartment, the Mafia boss and the waitress became allies. Salvatore brought Eve to a secret chamber buried deep in the basement of Ferraro Tower, a place even the highest-ranking members of the family didn't know existed, the room where his father, Giovanni Ferraro, had stored every critical document across 40 years of rule. The space was protected by a complex security system only Salvatore could access, and when the thick steel door slid open, Eve stepped into a vault lined with metal filing cabinets arranged like silent graves holding the secrets of an entire empire. They began searching records from 5 years earlier, the final months before Thomas Carter died, and the work demanded a patience so extreme Eve felt she might go mad among thousands of pages filled with numbers and codes. Yet she didn't stop, couldn't stop, because somewhere in this mountain of paper lay the truth about her father's death, and she would find it even if she had to read every page. On the third night, when both of them were exhausted and their vision blurred from lack of sleep, Eve found it. A thin folder hidden inside a locked drawer marked only by 2 faded handwritten words in black ink, Thanatos. She opened it and began to read, and with every line her face paled further, her hand started to tremble. And when she passed the file to Salvatore, her voice was little more than a raw whisper. "You need to see this." Salvatore took the folder and started reading, and his world fractured piece by piece with every page. Project Thanatos, named for the Greek god of death, was a massive human trafficking and money laundering network spanning continents from Eastern Europe through Asia to the Americas. Thousands of women and children abducted and sold like merchandise. Billions in dirty money washed through shell corporations and bank accounts in offshore havens. Salvatore read the figures and felt sick. $2 billion in just the past 5 years. More than 5,000 victims recorded. And that was only what appeared in this file. The real number had to be far higher. But what shattered him most wasn't the scale of the crimes. It was the name listed as the project leader, Giancarlo Rizzo. And beside it, the approval signature of his own father, Giovanni Ferraro. "That's impossible," Salvatore whispered, his voice cracking. "My father would never do this. He had principles. He'd never touch trafficking." Eve pointed to a handwritten note at the bottom of the page, the script different from the rest of the document. "That's my father's handwriting," she said. And when Salvatore read the line, his blood seemed to freeze. "The signature of G. Ferraro is forged. I've verified it. Giancarlo is operating behind the boss's back. I'll report to Giovanni on the 15th, Thomas Carter." "The 15th, Eve said, trembling. "My father died on the 14th, one day before he planned to tell the truth." Salvatore sank into a chair, his head spinning from what they'd uncovered. Giancarlo had forged his father's signature to run a trafficking empire under the Ferraro patriarch's nose, had made billions selling human lives while posing as a loyal advisor, and when Thomas Carter discovered it, Giancarlo had killed him before he could warn Giovanni. "But my father," Salvatore asked hoarsely. "My father died 3 years ago of heart failure, that's what I always believed." Eve turned the pages and stopped at a medical report. "This is Giovanni Ferraro's examination 6 months before his death," she said slowly. According to this, his heart was perfectly healthy. Salvatore grabbed the report and read every line, the truth hitting him like a fist. His father hadn't died of heart disease. His father had been murdered, and the likely killer was Giancarlo, the man who'd sat at Giovanni's bedside in his final hours, poured his last glass of water, cried the loudest at the funeral, then whispered to Salvatore that he was too young to lead and needed guidance from older men. "I'll kill him," Salvatore snarled, eyes blazing with unhinged fury. "I'll tear him apart." Eve placed a hand on his arm, the first time she'd initiated contact since they met, and the touch cooled his rage slightly. "Not yet," she said with terrifying calm. "We need more proof. We need to know who else is involved in this operation. We need to make sure that when we move, he has nowhere to run. If you kill him now, the others will escape, and the truth will be buried forever." Salvatore looked at her, into brown eyes that had witnessed too much suffering yet retained astonishing clarity. And he nodded. "You're right," he admitted. "We'll do this your way. But when the time comes, Giancarlo is mine." The nights that followed blurred together inside the secret chamber beneath Ferraro Tower, where fluorescent lights never dimmed and time seemed to stall among towering stacks of files. Eve and Salvatore worked side by side in near silence, each submerged in separate oceans of paperwork. Yet now and then their eyes met across the piles of documents, and in those brief exchanges something shifted between them that neither wanted to acknowledge. Salvatore began noticing small details about Eve he'd never paid attention to before. The way she bit her lip when wrestling with a difficult passage. The way she always poured 2 cups of coffee without being asked. The way her brown eyes lit up whenever she uncovered a new clue as though it were the most precious treasure in the world. She wasn't like any woman he'd known. She didn't try to impress him, didn't fear him, didn't want anything from him beyond the truth. And that brutal honesty stirred a respect in him he'd never felt for anyone. As for Eve, she too started seeing things she hadn't expected behind the ruthless facade of the Mafia boss. She noticed how he frowned when reading about the trafficking victims, how his fists tightened until his knuckles blanched whenever another of Giancarlo's crimes surfaced, how his eyes darkened whenever his father was mentioned as though the wound were still bleeding after 3 years. One night, when the clock struck 3 in the morning, and both of them were too exhausted to make sense of a single line, Salvatore suddenly broke the silence. "Do you know what the worst part is?" His voice hoarse with fatigue. "It's that I trusted him. I trusted Giancarlo for 3 years. Let him whisper in my ear that I wasn't as good as my father. Let him pull my strings like a puppet while he kept selling human lives right under my nose." Eve looked at him and saw real pain in those dark eyes. Saw that the most feared man in New York was only a man crushed beneath the weight of mistakes he hadn't even known he'd made. "You didn't know," she said softly, her voice gentling without her meaning it to. "No one can blame themselves for trusting the wrong person when that person has spent a lifetime deceiving them. But I should have known," Salvatore replied, staring into nothing as though replaying every disastrous decision from the past. "My father tried to warn me with that letter. He wrote it in Latin because he knew Giancarlo couldn't read it. He hoped I'd understand, but I was too foolish." "You're not foolish," Eve said, and before she realized what she was doing, her hand had reached for his, warmth flowing from her skin into his chilled fingers like a beam of light in the dark. "You were just a grieving son with no one left to trust, but now you know the truth, and you'll fix it." Salvatore glanced down at her hand resting over his, and in that instant something inside him softened, the ice he'd built around his heart for so many years beginning to crack under the unexpected tenderness from the woman he'd once humiliated. They sat in silence for a long while, neither speaking, neither pulling away, and the cold basement room somehow felt a little warmer. After that night, they pressed on with renewed energy, and the evidence began to multiply. Lists of Swiss and Cayman bank accounts, names of officials and politicians bribed into silence, addresses of warehouses where victims were held before being shipped elsewhere, and one name surfaced again and again in every transaction: Giancarlo Rizzo, the devil in human skin, who'd destroyed countless lives over the years. "We're almost there," Eve said late one night, her voice weary yet her eyes still burning with resolve. "Just a little more. If we can find a living witness, he won't have anywhere left to run." Salvatore nodded, but deep inside him a fear took root he didn't dare voice. The fear that when it was all over, when Giancarlo was exposed and justice finally served, Eve would no longer have any reason to stand beside him, and that thought hurt more than anything he'd ever endured. The news arrived early one morning, when Eve and Salvatore had managed only a few hours of sleep after another long night buried in files. Marco calling in a rushed voice to report that one of the family's informants had uncovered something explosive. Thomas Carter might still be alive and was being held in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of New Jersey. Eve shot upright as if struck by lightning, her eyes wide and her heart hammering in her chest. Her father might still be alive. For 5 years she'd mourned him, suffered through the belief that he'd died alone in flames, but if he was alive, then there was still hope, still a chance she could hold him again. "I have to go," she said with unshakable resolve, her eyes blazing. "If there's even a 1% chance my father's alive, I'm going there." Salvatore looked at her with concern he no longer tried to hide. "This could be a trap," he warned tensely. "Giancarlo knows we're investigating. If he knows what we're looking for, he won't sit still and wait to die." Eve knew he was right. Reason told her this sounded far too much like a trap to be real. But her heart wouldn't listen, not when her father was involved. "If you won't go, then I'll go alone," she said, and Salvatore knew she meant it. This woman had survived 5 years of poverty and despair without breaking. She wouldn't retreat when faced with even the faintest chance to recover her father. "All right," Salvatore exhaled. "But we're going together and I'm bringing people." They reached the warehouse at dusk, when the last light stained the clouds blood red, and from the instant the car rolled to a stop, before the crumbling structure, Salvatore sensed something was wrong. "Too quiet," he murmured, his hand already gripping the gun hidden inside his jacket. But before he could order a retreat, everything erupted. Gunfire thundered from every direction. Salvatore's men dropped one by one, blood spraying across cracked concrete, and from the warehouse shadows dozens of figures surged forward, surrounding them with weapons leveled at their heads. Salvatore dragged Eve behind the car, shielding her with his body while returning fire. But there were too many, too coordinated. This wasn't a random ambush, but a meticulously prepared trap. "That's enough, Salvatore," a familiar voice called from behind the shooters. And when Eve looked up, she saw Giancarlo Rizzo stepping from the darkness with a triumphant smile etched into his wrinkled face, fox-like eyes glittering with open delight. "You've disappointed me," Giancarlo said in a mockingly regretful tone. "I'd hoped you'd stay my obedient puppet until I was ready to dispose of you. But you had to play detective with this little waitress." "You killed my father," Salvatore roared, eyes blazing with hatred. "You forged his signature. You ran that trafficking ring behind his back. And when Thomas Carter found out, you killed him too." Giancarlo laughed loudly, the sound echoing through the hollow warehouse like something demonic. "Oh, no. He shook his head with twisted amusement. "I didn't kill Thomas Carter. He's still alive, locked away somewhere far from here, because he knows too much and I needed to be sure he never spoke. But Giovanni was different. Your father should have listened to me and abandoned that foolish ideal of staying away from trafficking. He was too old and too soft. So I helped him rest permanently, just a little poison in his water every day for 6 months. Slow and painful, exactly what he deserved for daring to stand in my way." Salvatore howled like a wounded beast and lunged for Giancarlo, but 3 gunmen slammed him to the ground before he'd taken 2 steps, barrels pressed to his head and a knee in his back. Eve tried to rush forward, but one of Giancarlo's men grabbed her from behind, a rough arm clamping her throat while a cold muzzle dug into her temple. "Don't kill him yet," Giancarlo ordered when his men started to squeeze their triggers. "I still need him to sign a few transfer documents, but the girl I don't need." He eyed Eve with contempt, except to make sure Salvatore cooperates. Salvatore lifted his head, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead into his eyes, and in those dark pupils Eve saw not fear but agony at being forced to watch her threatened while he could do nothing. "Don't worry," she whispered to him with her eyes. "We'll get out of this." And she prayed she wasn't lying. Giancarlo was ordering his men to bind Salvatore. The sound erupted, engines roaring in the distance and racing toward them at terrifying speed, and before anyone could react, 3 glossy black SUVs smashed through the warehouse's rusted gate, metal fragments exploding everywhere. Marco leapt from the first vehicle with a machine gun in his hands, followed by more than 20 of the Ferraro family's most loyal shooters, the ones Salvatore had secretly contacted before leaving and instructed to come to this location if he didn't call back within an hour. The firefight detonated like hell, breaking open. Deafening gunshots ricocheting through the warehouse, bullets slicing the air and slamming into concrete pillars, blood and bodies crashing onto the floor amid chaotic screams. Giancarlo cursed violently as he watched his flawless plan unravel, retreating while barking orders for his men to push forward. And in that split second of turmoil, the thug holding Eve was distracted, the muzzle shifting slightly away from her temple as he turned toward the gunfire. Eve didn't waste the only chance life ever offered. Years of hardship had taught her that second opportunities don't come, and she moved on pure survival instinct, driving her elbow into the man's stomach until he doubled over, twisting and wrenching the gun from his grip in a motion she hadn't known she was capable of. And before he could react, she aimed straight at Giancarlo, trying to flee. The shot rang out from her trembling hands, the bullet tearing into Giancarlo's right leg and dropping him screaming onto the concrete, blood flooding from the wound and staining his expensive trousers. Eve stood frozen with the smoking gun shaking in her grip. The first time she'd ever shot anyone, the sensation both horrifying and liberating. She'd wanted to kill him for what he'd done to her father, yet held back because death was too merciful for someone like Giancarlo. He needed to live to face justice. In the chaos of the crossfire, a secondary extraction team loyal only to Giancarlo utilized a smokescreen to pull their wounded leader through a hidden freight elevator, vanishing into the night before Marco's men could lock down the perimeter. Salvatore broke free from the men restraining him in the chaos and sprinted to Eve, grabbing her hand as he shouted over the gunfire that they had to leave immediately and Marco would handle the rest. They bolted for one of the SUVs with its engine roaring, bullets whistling past them, but by some miracle missing, and when Salvatore shoved Eve inside and vaulted into the driver's seat, he floored the accelerator as though demons were chasing them. The vehicle tore out of the warehouse, plowing through gunmen trying to block the exit, tires grinding over bodies and shell casings, and only when they reached the highway and merged into city traffic did Salvatore finally breathe again. Eve sat in the passenger seat with hands still shaking. The gun dropped onto the floor, but the icy weight of the metal lingering in her palms. "Are you okay?" Salvatore asked, glancing at her with undisguised worry. Eve nodded, though she wasn't sure she was. She'd just shot a man, nearly died, and still hadn't found her father. Yet Giancarlo had said he was alive, and that was enough to keep her fighting. Salvatore pulled a small USB drive from his jacket, his gaze hard and resolute as he watched the road ahead. "This is a copy of everything on Project Thanatos," he said. "I made it before we left in case the worst happened, and now it's time to use it." Eve looked at him and instantly understood. "We're releasing it all," she said, not as a question, but a declaration. Salvatore nodded, a cold smile touching his lips for the first time since leaving the warehouse. "Giancarlo wanted war," he said. "Then we'll give him war, not with bullets, but with truth. And once the whole world knows what he's done, there won't be any hole deep enough for him to hide in." The car stopped in front of a decaying industrial building in Astoria, Queens, that from the outside looked no different from an abandoned warehouse with rusted doors and brick walls smeared in graffiti. But Salvatore knew that inside worked one of the most brilliant technological minds the underworld had ever produced. He led Eve through a side entrance and down a narrow stairwell into the basement, and when they crossed the final threshold, she had to pause for her eyes to adjust to what lay before her. The cavernous space glowed with flickering blue light from dozens of stacked computer monitors forming a wall of technology. Cooling fans hummed without pause. Cables slithered across the floor like metal serpents, and in the center of that organized chaos, a gaunt man with hair tangled like a bird's nest sat before 3 screens at once, fingers dancing across the keyboard at a speed the naked eye couldn't follow. "Phantom Salvatore," called out, and the man turned, his eyes lighting up like neon when he recognized who stood there. Salvatore Ferraro. His voice rasped like someone who hadn't spoken to another soul in days. "I hear you're having a little trouble with your aging advisor." And when Salvatore handed him the USB Phantom, plugged it in, and began scanning the files, a low whistle escaping his thin lips. "Project Thanatos," he muttered. "International trafficking and money laundering. You're asking me to burn an empire. Salvatore, you know I've always liked the smell of smoke. I need you to spread all of this worldwide," Salvatore said with cold resolve. "Not just leak it to the press, but seed it across thousands of servers. I want it to exist forever, no matter who tries to erase it." Phantom spun his chair to face him, his expression serious for the first time since they'd arrived. "A truth virus," he said slowly. "Something that can't be deleted and can't be buried. This'll take a few hours to set up, but once it's triggered, nothing on this planet can stop it from spreading." Phantom got to work, and even Salvatore could only wait in a corner of the basement while time crawled as though every second were being stretched into infinity. Night fell outside, though. They couldn't see it from the windowless underground room, and in the silence, broken only by Phantom's relentless typing, Eve and Salvatore began to talk for the first time. Not about Giancarlo or Project Thanatos, but about themselves. Salvatore told her about his childhood, about a boy raised in the shadow of his father who never felt good enough, about nights spent listening to his father and Giancarlo discuss business while wondering whether he'd ever earn the right to sit in that chair, about the loneliness of standing at the top with no one left to trust. Eve listened and answered with stories of her own, about the mother who'd died when she was 12 and left a hollow nothing could fill, about a father who'd worked himself raw, raising 2 daughters and teaching her ancient Latin late at night because he said knowledge was the only thing no one could ever steal from her, about Nora with her luminous smile and lips always tinged blue from a cruel heart condition, about the 5 years she'd survived after losing her father, losing hope, losing everything except love for her sister. They talked through the night, and with every story shared, the wall between them crumbled a little more. The Mafia boss and the waitress, 2 people from utterly different worlds, beginning to see not enemies or temporary allies but kindred, souls who'd endured too much and refused to fall. Near dawn, when exhaustion weighed heavy on them both, Eve unconsciously rested her head on Salvatore's shoulder, and he didn't push her away, instead letting her sleep there, the warmth of her body spreading across his chest like a small flame. In winter darkness, "It's done," Phantom's voice cut through the stillness, exactly 6 in the morning, and both Eve and Salvatore jolted upright, staring at the dozens of screens. Now showing the same image, the words Project Thanatos splashed across every major news outlet, Giancarlo Rizzo's name and photograph dominating each headline, and within minutes the world reeled as the truth about the massive trafficking and laundering network detonated across the globe. "Giancarlo's empire is collapsing," Phantom said with grim satisfaction, "and nothing on Earth is going to save him now." While Phantom was helping them sift through thousands of newly released data files, Eve suddenly spotted an address buried inside a separate document. Giancarlo had clearly never meant for anyone to find a small house deep in the remote, forested mountains of Vermont, marked as the detention site for Witness T. Carter, and Eve's heart nearly stopped when she read it, because her father could be there alive only a few hours away by car, and she couldn't wait another second. They left immediately, even though neither of them had slept all night. Salvatore driving while Eve sat in the passenger seat with her eyes locked on the map on her phone as the car tore down highways and then winding mountain roads through endless pine forests. And after 5 hours crossing 3 states, they finally arrived just as the sun climbed high over the clear blue New England sky. The small wooden cabin lay hidden among maple trees, turning gold and orange for autumn. Surrounded by such silence, Eve could hear leaves brushing the ground, and when she stepped out of the car, her legs trembled so badly she nearly collapsed. Salvatore walked beside her, one hand resting gently on her back to steady her, and together they approached the weathered wooden door. Eve lifting her hand to knock, but before her knuckles touched the surface, it opened from inside, and standing there, framed by morning sunlight, was a man whose hair had gone completely white, whose gaunt face was carved with 5 years of suffering, yet whose eyes were still the same eyes Eve had longed for through countless sleepless nights. "Dad," the word broke from Eve's mouth like a sob as she threw herself into his arms with every ounce of strength left in her exhausted body, and Thomas Carter caught her, his hands shaking as he clutched her, as though afraid this was only a dream and she would vanish if he loosened his hold for even a second. "Evelyn," his voice rasped and cracked with emotion, "my girl, I knew you'd find me, I always knew you would." They stood there, clinging to each other and crying, 5 years apart, 5 years believing the other was dead, 5 years of pain and despair melting away in the warmth of a reunion neither had dared imagine. And when they finally pulled back, Thomas noticed Salvatore standing a few steps away, suspicion flickering in his eyes, before Eve explained that he didn't need to worry, that Salvatore had helped uncover the truth, and that he, too, was one of Giancarlo's victims just as they were. Thomas nodded slowly and invited them inside, and in the cozy little room with a fire crackling in the hearth, he told his story how 5 years earlier, after discovering Project Thanatos and grasping the scale of Giancarlo's crimes, he did plan to go to Giovanni, but Giancarlo had moved first, stopping his car the night he left the office, knocking him unconscious. And when he woke, he was in this cabin with a guard, and the warning that if he tried to escape or contact anyone, his daughters would die, that he couldn't risk Eve's life or Nora's, so he stayed waiting and praying every day that someone would uncover the truth and free him. Eve gripped her father's hand, tears streaming down her face, and told him with fierce certainty that it was over, now that Giancarlo had been exposed, that the whole world knew what he'd done, and that he'd pay for everything. Outside by the window, Salvatore stood alone, looking into the room where father and daughter held each other, and something strange swelled in his chest. Joy that Eve had found her father at last tangled with a deep aching grief as he realized he'd never have a moment like that. His own father was gone, forever, and he hadn't even been able to say goodbye, and a single tear slid down Salvatore's cheek, the first he'd shed since his father died, which he wiped away quickly before anyone could see. But when he looked up, he found Eve watching him through the glass, her eyes filled with understanding and something warmer he didn't dare name, and she stepped outside, came to his side, and without a word placed her hand over his, the warmth of her touch seeping into his cold skin like a promise that even if he'd lost his father, he didn't have to be alone anymore. They were driving back toward New York with Thomas in the back seat when Salvatore's phone rang with Marco on the line, and what his brother said made the blood in Salvatore's veins turn to ice because Giancarlo had escaped the warehouse. Before the police arrived, he was furious, and he knew about Nora. He knew she was at Mount Sinai Hospital, scheduled for heart surgery the next morning, and Marco had just learned he had sent a hit team there for revenge. Eve overheard the call, and her face went white as paper, because her little sister, the child she had sacrificed everything to protect for 5 years, was in danger, and she was hundreds of miles away, and Salvatore slammed the accelerator so hard the car seemed to fly along the highway. Yet he knew, no matter how fast they drove, they would not beat Giancarlo's killers back to the city, and in that instant, he made a decision that might cost Tim his life. He called Marco and ordered him to intercept the assassins at all costs, then looked at Eve with absolute resolve and told her to keep driving and get her father home safely, because he would go another way. And before she could argue, he pulled over and jumped out, sprinting toward a private helicopter pad he knew nearby, and using money and the weight of the Ferraro name to charter a helicopter to Manhattan immediately. Giancarlo had used his remaining untraceable assets to bribe the hospital's night security chief, ensuring that the alarms on the pediatric floor were disabled, and the local police were diverted by several false reports of violence across the city. Salvatore reached Mount Sinai just minutes before Giancarlo's men arrived, bursting into the pediatric cardiology wing, where Nora lay asleep awaiting surgery. And when 3 assassins stepped out of the elevator with guns hidden beneath their coats, he planted himself in front of her door like an unbreakable wall. Gunfire exploded through the corridor, nurses and patients screaming as they ran, Salvatore dropping one killer while the other two were too fast. A bullet tearing into his left shoulder, another punching through his right thigh, and he crashed. To the floor, blood pouring out. Yet even then, he refused to retreat, crawling toward Nora's door and shielding it with his body ready to die to protect the sister of the woman he had fallen in love with without daring to admit it. And the last assassin advanced, gun aimed straight at his head as Salvatore closed his eyes, waiting for the end. But the shot that rang out was not the one meant to kill him. It came from behind and dropped the man with a hole between his eyes. Eve stood at the far end of the hallway, smoke curling from the barrel in her hand, her eyes red from crying, yet her stare hard as steel because she had run from the parking garage as fast as her legs could carry her, and she had made it in. Time to save the man bleeding in front of her sister's room. And she sobbed as she knelt beside him, pressing her hands to his shoulder to stop the blood, asking why he had done it, why he would risk his life for Nora. Salvatore gave a weak smile, blood on his lips, but his dark eyes still shining as he whispered that $5 million had not been enough to settle the debt, and that because Nora was her sister, she mattered to her, so she mattered to him, too. And Eve broke down at those words, bending to press a kiss to his forehead, the first kiss between them, gentle and salty with tears. Sirens wailed outside. And minutes later, the FBI flooded the hospital, having tracked the assassin's phones and traced Giancarlo to an apartment nearby, and news of the arrest spread across television screens that same night, with Giancarlo Rizzo dragged out in cuffs, his face gray with rage, reporters shouting questions about Project Thanatos, about the victims, and the years he had lived in, lies and blood. Eve sat beside Salvatore's bed in recovery, gripping his hand, while doctors said he had lost a great deal of blood but would live. And in the next room, Nora still slept peacefully, unaware she had nearly died, and that a stranger had been, willing to give his life to protect her. And the following morning, Nora's surgery went ahead as planned, and succeeded completely. And when the doctor emerged, smiling to say her heart was strong at last, Eve finally let herself collapse and cry for the end of the nightmare for her, a sister's life, and because for the first time in many years, she did not have to fight alone anymore. 3 months passed like a dream Eve hardly dared to believe was real. 3 months of healing, of justice, and of new beginnings she had never thought she would be allowed to claim. Nora recovered quickly after the surgery, color returning to her cheeks instead of the old pallor, her lips no longer turning blue whenever she climbed the stairs, her clear laughter echoing through the new apartment Eve had rented in a safer Brooklyn neighborhood, one with wide sunlit windows and no water stains creeping across the ceiling. Thomas Carter took the stand in federal court as the star witness in the Giancarlo Rizzo case, recounting everything he knew about Project Thanatos with a steady voice and eyes that never wavered. 5 years of captivity failing to break him and only sharpening his resolve to drag the man who had destroyed his life into the light. The trial stretched across 3 weeks with hundreds of pieces of evidence presented from the data Phantom had released to testimony from survivors of the trafficking ring. And when the judge read the verdict on the final day, the courtroom fell into absolute silence. Giancarlo Rizzo was sentenced to life without parole for human trafficking, money laundering, first-degree murder in the assassination of Giovanni Ferraro, and dozens of additional charges, his face no longer that of a powerful kingpin but of an aging beast stripped of its claws, his calculating eyes emptied of cunning and filled only with the hollow certainty that he would die behind bars. Eve sat in the front row when the sentence was delivered, one hand gripping her father's and the other Salvatore's, and as she watched Giancarlo led away in cold iron chains, she did not feel triumph or satisfaction the way she had imagined she might, only a profound release as though a massive stone that had crushed her chest for 5 years had finally been lifted. The Ferraro empire fractured in the weeks that followed, not completely but in every criminal structure Giancarlo had built behind Giovanni's back. Federal agents dismantling the trafficking and laundering networks, dozens of accomplices arrested, billions of dollars in illicit assets seized, and surviving victims at last freed and reunited with their families. Salvatore watched the empire his father had created torn apart piece by piece, and instead of the agony he had expected, he felt a strange peace, as though a weight he had carried his entire life had finally been set down, and he made a decision that might have turned his father in the grave yet perhaps might have made him proud. Walking away from the Mafia, selling most of the family holdings, and using the money to establish the Giovanni Ferraro Foundation dedicated to helping trafficking survivors rebuild their lives. The press called him mad. The remaining elders branded him a traitor. But Salvatore no longer cared, because he had spent his life chasing other people's expectations, and all they had led him to was darkness, and now it was time to live by his own compass, by what his heart told him was right. He stopped wearing tailored suits, stopped sitting in shadowed rooms negotiating dirty deals, and instead devoted his days to the support centers funded by his foundation, listening to stories of suffering and doing everything he could to help mend what had been broken. And every evening when his work was done, he drove to the modest Brooklyn apartment where Eve, Nora, and Thomas now lived. And for the first time in his life, Salvatore Ferraro understood what it meant to have a real family, not one bound by blood and enforced loyalty, but one formed by love and choice. 6 months after Giancarlo was sentenced, a special dedication ceremony took place in the poorest neighborhood of Brooklyn, where Eve had once lived in a crumbling apartment, sleepless over medicine money for her sister. The Carter Ferraro Community Center, rising in the middle of the block, like a symbol of hope, not a lavish palace of marble and crystal chandeliers, like the properties Salvatore once owned, but a modest structure of clear glass walls, welcoming sunlight with a colorful playground for children and free classrooms for adults hoping to learn a trade. A place meant for people like Eve 5 years earlier, those barely surviving who needed a hand to help them stand again. The opening unfolded amid laughter from hundreds of local residents, children racing across bright green grass, adults chatting with smiles, and at the heart of it all, 4 people standing before a polished bronze plaque bearing the center's name. Eve in a simple white dress, her brown hair loose on her shoulders, her eyes glowing with happiness she never thought she would feel. Beside her, Nora, now 18, with healthy color in her cheeks and a strong, steady heart, laughing with neighborhood children she would soon volunteer to teach. Thomas Carter, standing with unmistakable pride, having regained his strength after 5 years of captivity and devoting the rest of his life to advising anti-trafficking organizations. And Salvatore, once the most ruthless mafia boss in New York, now in a plain shirt and jeans, his lethal chill replaced by a rare, sincere smile. He turned to Eve, his dark eyes warm as they had never been, and said softly that he still owed her. Eve shook her head with shining eyes and teased that it was the $5 million. And Salvatore shook his head too, saying it was not money but something far greater, everything she had taught him about being human. And Eve smiled, touching his cheek, saying he had paid with something more precious than any fortune, by changing, by daring to abandon everything, and begin again by daring to love, after a lifetime spent learning how to hate. Late afternoon, as the sun dipped and gilded the small garden behind the center, the 4 of them sat on a long wooden bench, watching children play their laughter, drifting like the sweetest music they had ever heard. Thomas said quietly that justice was not about revenge but about ending fear, and Salvatore nodded, squeezing Eve's hand, adding that sometimes justice was also a new beginning, where old wounds became fuel to do something better. They sat in silence, watching twilight fade and the first stars emerge, and in that moment all the suffering of the past seemed to dissolve, leaving only peace and hope for what lay ahead. Eve and Salvatore's story was not merely about love or justice, but a reminder that no matter how deeply life pushes us into darkness, if we refuse to surrender, if we dare to rise and fight for what is right, then light will always be waiting. At the end of the road, sometimes those with nothing left to lose are the ones powerful enough to change the world, and sometimes those who appear most ruthless are the ones who long most desperately to be loved. If this story touched your heart, please tap like and share this video with those you care about. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss meaningful stories each day. Tell us how this story made you feel, and whether it reminded you of something in real life by leaving a comment below, because we'd truly love to hear the thoughts from deep in your heart. Wishing everyone watching strong health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.